welcome everybody to yet another wonderful, fun-filled, sip your coffee and listen, or clean house and listen episode of Ichabod's House podcast. We are on season 2, episode 6, An Incident of Fairies, which I'm really interested in hearing.
This, I need to just put in a little correction. It's actually episode 7. We are having a bonus episode between our last episode on ghosts and this episode. So this episode is actually going to be airing on March 28th. On March 21st, we are having a bonus episode on Ouija boards and our personal experiences with ghosts. And then this episode, if you are listening to this, it is March 28th.
March 21st is a big day, I'd like to add. Big day at Ichabod's house. Someone is turning 52. Jennifer has a birthday on March 21st.
I do.
I won't sing for you right now, but
thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
That.
It is a big day. So, so listen, and that episode that airs with Alex and Lauren, my son and daughter-in-law, is really interesting, and it's about their stay at the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Mm-hmm. We're going to get to An Incident of Fairies in just a minute. We do have a couple Google and Beyonds to discuss. The first one is we wanted to know if the Mansion of Health in New Jersey is still standing, and I cannot find any information on that. So I don't know. Who knows?
It's a mystery.
It is a mystery. But if anybody does know, please reach out to us and let us know, so we'll all be in the know. You know?
I'm guessing if you can't find any information on it, that it is not still standing, that it's no longer
I would agree with that.
Structurally sound.
I would agree with that. Okay, and the second thing is we discussed what is the difference between an axe and a hatchet. And a hatchet is a miniature axe. An axe is a two-handed weapon or tool. I mean, in this case, it would be a weapon. In the case of Lizzie Borden. And a hatchet is a one-handed weapon, easily wielded by a petite female.
So if you are a petite female and you need to chop something, defend
preferably
yourself.
Not a human.
We are not in any way advocating the use of a hatchet in the senseless attack on another human being. You could defend yourself. If you need to defend yourself, you've got a hatchet there. You can use it, block,
right,
parry, thrust, twist, whatever. Or if you need to chop, say, salad or
an onion.
You
could chop an onion. Some potatoes.
So you can use it for that. And then that's what we would certainly recommend.
Yes, I would agree. Now we have Ichabod's Nose. You got anything fun for Ichabod's Nose? Or depressing? Fun or depressing? I don't care.
I've been watching a lot of Seinfeld, which is always good. Mm-hmm. And I completed the series 1 of Worst Roommate Ever on Netflix.
Yes, I did that last weekend, and so good.
Very, very worthwhile. And I've also started rewatching Bridgerton season 1 because,
Why not?
We had some snowy days. I couldn't do anything except have a fire and
a little wine,
stare at the TV. And what do you got for Ichabod's Nose?
I have a couple things. I watched on Netflix Life After Death with Tyler Henry, and he just blows your mind every time. He's the medium. He used to do the Hollywood celebrity readings. Yeah, and there's a lot there. I mean, he's good. He's like, nice. I don't know how he could fake it. You know what I mean? I don't know. I suppose it could all be scripted, and they film it then, too. So there's that. But I don't believe that happens. And then we went out last night with some friends. Well, we had dinner first, and then we went to Topgolf. But I did not golf because it was cold as fuck outside, and we just sat they have heated couches there at Topgolf. Anyway, I was telling one of my girlfriends, Ashley, that we should have a quote-unquote book club where we don't really have to read the books, but we just get together once a month. And she said, I've never been much of a reader, but I've thought about becoming a reader. She's hilarious. I love her to death. And I said, well, if you don't mind not reading the classics, and she's like, I don't mind that at all. I said you need to download these 2 apps and read about werewolves and werebears, because that's some hot and heavy stuff. It's just a guilty pleasure that has no literary value whatsoever. I was reading a new book on one of those, and I forget the title. I think it's something like The Alpha's Virgin Princess or something. I don't know.
It's like porn, Andy. Does the title really matter?
It really doesn't, because they're all the same story.
It's really irrelevant.
It's always the young she-wolf who is awkward and catches the alpha's eye, and somebody's always pissed that she catches the alpha's eye, or they mate, or what, I don't know. Anyway, it's very interesting, Jen.
How many nipples does the she-wolf have when she's in human form? And if 2 wolf beings conceive in human form, can she give birth in canine form? And if she does she have a full litter, or does she just have one? And if so, is that one capable of becoming a werewolf? And how many nipples does that offspring have?
That is a lot of questions.
Well, also, if a human male is circumcised, what does his wang look like when he's in wolf form? Does he get the red rocket, or is it just always red rocket because he doesn't have the furry foreskin?
Okay.
I don't think these writers have thought things. There's a lot of research that goes into writing a book, and I
think that you are putting way too much into it, because if you would read it, you would understand. They're linked with their animal counterpart. They're mentally linked. See, like it's a different creature that lives inside their mind. And then when they transform, they're still both together, so they're either in human form or the wolf form, but they're mentally linked the whole time.
I understand.
It's like an alter ego. If they are pregnant, they're just pregnant with one or twins. There's not a litter.
Okay.
I think. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I haven't read it yet.
See? Okay. When Bruce Wayne becomes the Batman, he puts on a costume. When a human becomes a werewolf, okay, all I'm saying is we had a dog growing up that had a lot of litters of puppies, and there were
a lot of nipples,
There were a lot of nipples there.
Okay, here's the thing though. She also chased cars and barked at them. If she had a human form, she would know better than to chase cars and bark at them. So there's a difference. It's not like what we traditionally think of as a wolf or a bear, because they have a human counterpart.
You're not addressing, you're evading the issue of the nipples, Andy. And I think we're just going to have to...
We're going to have to table it. We're going to need to put a pin in it and do a little research.
Pin in this. Mm-hmm. I think this should be an episode of 60 Minutes. Someone needs to look into this, because I could never read one of these books, because that would be what's going in my head. So I've also seen dogs mate where their butts are stuck together. And
right. I don't know how that happens. That's weird.
So I'm just saying, it doesn't look very sensual or arousing to me. And if you...
I can tell this really bothers you. If you can dumb it down and just enjoy it for what it is.
Humans have 2 nipples. Humans have 2 nipples.
Oh, yeah. So Tyler Henry and werewolf, werebear books. There you go.
Now, we all know of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as the guy who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories. In fact, Holmes is what one would consider a household name. His uncanny ability to gaze at an individual and deduce where he or she was from, what he had for lunch 2 days prior, and even what country his great-aunt, dead for 3 years, immigrated from.
Only someone with the brains and creativity of this hybrid Dr. Writer, which was exactly what Doyle was, could have birthed a detective like Holmes. After all, it had to be someone with a sharp intellect as well as a mind unfettered by too much logic and narrow vision who could conjure a being like Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly. Now, while some might conclude that since Sherlock himself is rational to a fault, unlikely to consider things such as ghosts, spirits, or specters, his creator could not possibly suffer this affliction. And yet, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was an ardent spiritualist and worked for decades not only to seek proof of life after death, but also to convince others of its existence.
Although the biography of Doyle is, in and of itself, enough to fill an entire episode, we are going to focus more on something that occurred near the end of his life, something that tarnished his reputation and got folks to questioning if he had, at last, gone off his rocker.
Yes. Although the events leading up to this incident first unfolded in 1917, news didn't reach Doyle until 1920. Nevertheless, it was baffling then and continued to baffle people until the 1980s and beyond. Even now, there's a question of new evidence in this case that could perhaps, according to some, give it the air of legitimacy. And we're going to do another episode on this, and that's all I'm going to say. Go ahead, Andy.
Well, that was quite the boring teaser. I'm not at all intrigued. No, I think that's great. I'm glad we're going to do another episode. Are we going to do another episode to talk about the legitimacy, or are we going to, I don't know. We'll just have to see. Now I am intrigued.
Just have to see. Now you are intrigued. So you intrigued
now
yourself.
I did intrigue myself. Well, I tend to do that. It's the werewolf books. Okay. In 1920, spiritualism was reaching its zenith. Seances remained popular, as did the religion of spiritualism. All this despite Kate Fox's confession in 1888 that the midnight knockings in 1848 and the religion they birthed was nothing more than a hoax.
You may remember from our series last year that the thumps heard in the Fox family's rural farmhouse one cold night in 1848 and the subsequent experiences reported by the girls, Kate and Maggie Fox, as well as their sister Leah, led to spirit tapping and table tipping throughout the U.S.
Yes, there was the sweaty ghost wrapped in the sheet.
Yes.
There
was a lot of mesmerizing that went on.
A lot of bound chick wow mesmerizing. Yes, for sure. One would have thought that with the confession of the aging Kate Fox that spiritualism would have died out and that those who participated in seances would have been viewed as daft or pathetic. But years later, people continued in their attempts to summon the dead.
In fact, people were so comfortable with the thought of another world, perhaps several worlds, existing in tandem with ours, that when two young girls claimed to have played with fairies on a regular basis and then offered up a photograph as proof, well, it wasn't all that hard for folks to believe. After all, if the dead could emit enough energy to possess a medium or tip a table over, why the hell couldn't fairies exist?
I completely agree with that. Even so, it wasn't until Sir Arthur Conan Doyle got involved in this story that it became something more than just a passing rumor. Once he got wind that someone had photographed something otherworldly, it became known as the Cottingley incident.
Which brings us to our sources for today. The Coming of the Fairies, the Cottingley Incident by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself. A second reference, Through a Glass Darkly, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Quest to Solve the Greatest Mystery of All by Laurence Roy Staines and Stephen Bechtel. And a third reference, The Secret of the Cottingley Fairies by F.R. Maher.
So it started like this. In 1920, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was chatting with his friend, Mr. Gow, who edited a publication called Light. During that discussion, Mr. Gow mentioned he'd heard tell that someone had actually taken pictures of fairies.
Now, Mr. Gow hadn't actually seen the pictures, but he knew someone who might have seen the pictures, maybe. Her name was Miss Scatcherd. Apparently nobody goes by their first name. Her name was Miss Scatcherd, and Doyle reported that she was, quote, a lady for whose knowledge and judgment I had considerable respect.
Maybe she mesmerized him.
Maybe.
Doyle managed to track her down and was told that she actually hadn't seen the pictures, but her friend, a certain Miss Gardner, had seen them. So a friend of a friend. She was talking about a friend of a friend, asking for a friend. As it turned out, Miss Gardner had a brother named Edward who was a theosophist. Theosophist? Theosophist. Theosophist. What is a theosophist, you ask? I don't know, but I feel like I have a lisp when I say it. This is one who ascribes to, quote, the belief that a knowledge of God may be achieved through ecstasy, direct intuition, or special individual relations, end quote, and is based on the teachings of that stout Russian medium, Madame Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott.
So I couldn't help but notice as I was writing this, ecstasy and special individual relations, and that sort of made me think of you and the stuff you've been reading lately. I'm just saying. Now, this gets confusing, which is how the spirits like it, so pay attention. Miss Scatcherd had a letter from Miss Gardner and sent an excerpt of this letter to Doyle, which wet his whistle even more. Here it is. I wish you could see a photo Edward has. He believes in fairies, pixies, goblins, etc. Children, in many cases, really see them and play with them. He has got into touch with a family in Bradford where the little girl Elsie and her cousin Frances constantly go into the woods and play with the fairies. The father and mother are skeptical and have no sympathy with their nonsense, as they call it, but an aunt whom Edward has interviewed is quite sympathetic with the girls. Some little time ago, Elsie said she wanted to photograph them and begged her father to lend his camera. For long he refused, but at last she managed to get the loan of it and one plate. Off she and Frances went into the woods near a waterfall. Frances enticed them, as they call it, and Elsie stood ready with the camera. Well, soon the three fairies appeared, and one pixie dancing in Frances's aura. Elsie snapped and hoped for the best. It was a long time before the father would develop the photo, but at last he did, and to his utter amazement, the four sweet little figures came out beautifully.
Well, color everyone shocked and dismayed. Whew! Now Doyle simply must see the pictures. Miss Scatcherd understood Doyle's desire to see the pictures and knew he wanted her to get in touch with Miss Gardner. So she agreed to track that bitch down.
Well, while Scatcherd was tracking Miss Gardner so that she could track Edward was busy getting that picture evaluated. He managed to get a hold of the negative and took it to a photography expert.
As one does. Naturally, the expert laughed when he was first asked to take a look at the negative. However, after evaluating it, he offered to buy it for £100. He reported the picture was genuine and not at all fake.
Edward declined to sell the negative, but he did have a print made and hung it in his house. He told his sister that clearly fairies were on the same line of evolution as winged insects because, of course they were. Everyone knows a fairy is just a mosquito with a more delicate face.
I didn't think that fairies ate blood, though. And as we know from our other fairy episode, they can be human size. So
we'll get into our other fairy episodes, the whole Bridget Cleary thing.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Edward also made plans to visit the family responsible for the picture and get all the details. After what seemed like an eternity, Doyle finally got word on the pictures. They had been sent to a woman named Miss E. Blomfield, who was Edward's cousin.
And now finally, we get to the pictures. Miss Blomfield wrote to Doyle and enclosed two photographs. One of a gnome dancing at the knee of a young girl sitting in the grass, and another with the second young girl peering at a ring of dancing fairies.
They always dance in rings.
They do.
Kind of like a 7th grader dance group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They do.
Maybe that's what they are. Maybe they're just junior high kids.
Dancing and snap. You got to do the snap. Snap your fingers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what I think. Well, Doyle was astounded. He was all in. He believed the pictures of the fairies were real and he pursued contact with Edward Gardner to find out the names of the family responsible for the images. The pair struck up a correspondence, and through that, Doyle learned that the girls were cousins from Yorkshire and were members of a family of mechanics, and they had reported playing with fairies and gnomes since babyhood.
There's no one more trustworthy than a Yorkshire mechanic. There just isn't.
I agree 100% on that.
If you are going to place a bunch of bets with your friends and you need someone to hold the money, you need to fly a Yorkshire mechanic in, because there's no one more trustworthy. There just isn't.
No.
There just isn't.
There just isn't. I agree 100% on that.
Edward reported he had been so taken aback by the pictures that he took them first to a photography expert and then to the Kodak company for evaluation. The men wanted to meet with these girls, but they were now ages 16 and 17 or so and were working for a living. So it was hard to get them together to be interviewed.
So who were these girls anyway? What were they like? What sort of work were they doing? Were they mechanics too? Well, their names were Frances Griffiths, who had spent part of her childhood in South Africa and had recently returned to England with her family, and Elsie Wright, who spent a lot of time playing in the woods near her home. And they were cousins, right?
Yes. These girls, as mentioned, had often told their parents that they played with fairies in the woods, but no one really believed them. In later years, when Frances was in her 70s, she continued to insist that the fairies were real. She said this:
"I was up the beck alone quite a lot after school. It was good to sit quietly on the willow branch and listen to the sound of the water, the odd bee buzzing, and an occasional splash as a frog plunged into a deep pool. I suppose I must have been daydreaming one day when I looked across the beck and saw a willow leaf twirling around rapidly, moving, as it were, on its own. I think it odd, as there was no breeze. I had never seen a leaf do that before. That was the beginning, although at the time I didn't realize it. The leaf was being held by a little man. The first time I saw the little man, he was about 18 inches high. He was walking purposefully down the bank on the willow side of the beck, holding a willow leaf in his hand, twiddling it very fast as he crossed the water to the other side. I wasn't unduly surprised. The beck was a wonderful place, and I wouldn't have been surprised at anything that happened there." What the hell is a beck?
It's a stream.
All right, a stream.
Yeah, it's a stream that ran behind their property. Photos that caused all the hubbub actually came along in 1917. Initially, Arthur Wright, Elsie's father and owner of the camera that captured the fairy pictures, believed the images to be faked. He searched the house for evidence that his daughter and niece had cut out images of fairies to be posed and photographed, but his search turned up nothing.
Frances still had friends in South Africa and even sent a copy of one of the pictures to them. She wrote this: "Elsie and I are friendly with the Beck fairies. Funny, I never used to see them in Africa. It must be too hot for them there."
In 1919, Elsie's mom, Polly, went to a lecture on fairy life given by the Theosophical Society. She heard the lecture was happening and decided to take along the pictures her daughter and niece had taken back in 1917. So it's 2 years old right now, the pictures. Now, the lecturer was fascinated and asked if he could show them at another lecture. Mom said yes, and it was at that lecture that Edward Gardner saw them and was all like, "What the actual fuck?" And he decided he needed to legit or bullshit those things right then and there. So he got a hold of the negatives.
And now we can legit or bullshit for a minute. Do you believe fairies exist? Could a camera circa 1920 capture images of dancing fairies?
So a camera from 1920 probably wouldn't be able to get much of a good action shot. So I'm guessing no, that a camera could not capture fairies.
What if? Do we know what the fairies were doing?
Yes, we have actual
Were
pictures
they
of the
leaning on a
fairies.
rock?
They were
Were
dancing.
they just standing? They were dancing. Maybe they were slow dancing, swaying to the music. You know, it wasn't like a hip hop or a Charleston.
Fairies are winged like mosquitoes with a face. And
But they don't have to move their wings all the time, do they?
no, but these fairies were action, leaping. You'll have to see the pictures in order
Like
to.
Tinkerbell.
Yeah.
Was Peter Pan written prior to this? I think it was. I think it was written prior to 1917, wasn't it?
I don't know.
Or maybe they were inspired by Tinkerbell. And they thought, we need to make some fairies up.
Maybe so.
I don't know. I'm, I don't think they're real. I believe in aliens. I believe in ghosts. I believe in other dimensions. I believe in possessions. I don't believe in fairies.
Okay.
Some fairy somewhere just lost its wings, but I just don't.
It's like you just took a big old can of Raid and sprayed the hell out of the fairy mound.
I know, and I'm normally all in on stuff, but I just don't believe in fairies.
Okay. I kind of am right there with you. Okay, so now we know how the fairy photos came to the attention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Let's talk a little bit more about the pictures themselves.
Oh, good. Okay, so it was Edward who first went to Yorkshire to see about the pictures, which had been taken near a waterfall close to Elsie's house. The first picture was taken in July of 1917 and was of a single fairy.
The second picture was taken in September of that year. At the time, Elsie was 16 years old and her cousin Frances was 10. Although there's a lot of debate about the actual age. They think their ages were more like 3 years apart instead of 6. There's variations in who was how old or whatever. Mm-hmm. At any rate, this picture was of a little gnome playing his pipes with a leg lifted as he prepared to step onto her knee. Frances, unfortunately, was just at Elsie's house for an extended visit, and it wasn't long before she had to leave. Now, for some reason, the fairies never showed up when the girls were apart.
Well, of course not. I mean, come on. So that's right. Apparently, in order for the fairies to come around, the girls had to be together. Kind of like the shadow people in our house in Ashland. Mm-hmm. We had to be together to see that, because I never saw them without you there. So now you may be wondering, hey, how does one entice fairies to come forward in order to play with them? And how does one convince them to pose for photos? For sure.
Yeah. Well, Elsie reported that she would just sort of sit quietly and think of them, and ere long the leaves of small shrubs along the edge of the stream wiggled in the wind, and maybe some fairy music played, and then a fairy or maybe a gnome would pop its head out to take a peek, wondering who was thinking of them. And then there would be frolicking and dancing, and then one of the girls could snap a picture. The fairies were like, bad hair, don't care.
Okay, well then they are not like junior high girls, because those girls care about their hair.
They do.
They totally do. Okay, so now here are some interesting facts about this whole Frances and Elsie and the fairy situation. One, the girls actually first saw the fairies in 1915, but didn't mention it until the first set of photos was taken in 1917. Two, fairies weren't the only things photographed. As mentioned, the girls also caught a picture of a gnome. Three, the fairies only appeared in warm or fair weather. They didn't show up anytime it was cold or rainy. Whew, my kind of fairies. Four, as time passed, the girls reported that the fairies appeared more transparent as opposed to solid, which was possibly a result of the girls' aging. Five, the fairies never stayed long. They showed up, danced, and vanished.
To the credit of some journalists, there were questions posed regarding the appearance of the fairies. Perhaps, some suggested, Elsie had cut out pictures of fairies from a storybook, pasted them on cardboard, and then posed them for a photo. After all, these fairies did have fairly modern flapper-style haircuts and clothing.
But believers in and defenders of the photos insisted they could not have been faked due to the fact that the girls knew nothing about photography and had never even used a camera prior to the incident.
Yes, but some pointed to the fact that Elsie had worked in a theater and was versed in the ways of the camera and could have successfully faked the picture.
Do we think that maybe Daddy-O could have played a part? Since it was his camera?
Don't know. We are just going to have to continue to follow this case out to the end, Andrea.
I guess so. All right, Jennifer. All right, so let's talk for just a second about what a faked picture is versus staged. Ooh, I like this. A fake photo is one that is tampered with at the level of the negative. Some cameras use glass plates for image exposure, and some use negative. So a faked picture would be one where a plate or negative was exposed twice so that two images would appear.
Exactly. Consider the spirit photography phase of the Victorian era, when you'd sit for a picture, and then when it was developed, your dead husband would show up standing behind you in that same suit he posed in on your wedding day, looking exactly the same as he did the day you got married.
And at any rate, a faked photo is one where the negative is somehow manipulated through either double exposure or direct tampering.
And it's very likely that in this particular case, the girls aren't necessarily being accused of creating a faked photo, but rather one that is staged.
Such as pictures of fairies cut from books and then taped or pasted onto a stiff backing and posed on a bed of moss. That kind of faked.
Exactly. Doyle, in his work, defends the girls against suspicion. He wrote this to defend the girls against subtle accusations printed in one article. It is clear that the writer has not had much acquaintance with psychic research. His surprise that young girls should not know whence appearances come or whither they go when they are psychic forms materializing in her own peculiar aura does not seem reasonable. It is a familiar fact also that psychic phenomena are always more active in warm, sunny weather than in damp or cold. Do you remember in the Fox Sisters thing, they always liked a good thunderstorm, right? Because they could conduct the medium can conduct spirits better during, so this completely contradicts that.
Well, now, wait a minute. That's through the spirit world. The fairies were actually on this realm. Oh, maybe not, because if they were transparent. If they got to be transparent as the girls got older, maybe they weren't really on this realm or in this realm.
Hard to say.
I'm so confused.
I know.
All right. Okay. Well, interestingly, folks did attempt to fake or stage similar pictures in an effort to discredit the girls. Ina Inman, a British photographer, and Judge Docker, an Australian, each produced cleverly faked/staged photos of elves to show how easily it could be done. But these did not, according to Doyle, stand up to scrutiny. The fakery was evident.
Furthermore, the photos taken by the young girls had been submitted to professional photographers and were deemed genuine. So the question arose, if these girls saw and played with fairies, was it possible there were others throughout Britain who had experienced something similar? Turns out the answer was yes.
Well, Mr. George A. Wade published an article about the fairies in the London Evening News on December 8th, 1920. In his article, he claimed that his friend, Mr. Hallwell Sutcliffe, the well-known novelist, reported, quote, that he personally knew a schoolmaster not far from his home who had again and again insisted that he had seen, talked with, and had played with real fairies in some meadows not far away near Skipton. He goes on to write, whilst in the same district I was informed by a man whom I knew to be thoroughly reliable that a young lady living in Skipton had mentioned to him more than once that she often went up to a spot in the dales, the name of which he gave, to play and dance with the fairies. Furthermore, in response to Mr. Wade's article, a lady wrote to the paper to give her own account of the experience with fairies. Mr. Wade wrote this account.
She stated that one evening, when walking along in the higher portion of a slope of the hills, to her intense astonishment, she saw in a meadow close below her fairies and sprites playing and dancing in large numbers. She imagined that she must be dreaming or under some hallucination, so she pinched herself and rubbed her eyes to make sure that she was really aware. Convinced of this, she looked again and still unmistakably saw the little people. She gave a full account of how they played, of the long time she watched them, and how at length they vanished. Without a doubt, she was convinced of the truth of her statement. Of course, she never gave the full account to me. She just said she could give a full account to me, so I can't publish that full account here, and no one will ever hear of the full account, but suffice it to say, she was quite trustworthy, and she didn't doubt her own statement, so I had no reason to doubt her, and fairies are real, and they like to dance.
Apparently in groups. All right, still, doubters doubted and haters hated. This fairy photography incident was rending the world in twain. And so, what to do?
Well, in July of 1920, Mr. Edward Gardner learned that Elsie's cousin Frances was coming for another visit. Gardner and Doyle had been talking about how it was the combined auras of the two girls that was needed in order to get the fairies to come out and play.
It's kind of like the Wonder Twins, and they had to come together to use their powers.
That's right.
That's what it's like. According to Doyle, this joining of auras to produce a stronger effect than either can get singly is common enough in psychic matters.
So Gardner gave the girls a camera and went on about his life. Doyle had business in Australia, so he headed off in that direction, and they waited to hear from the girls.
It had been 3 years since the girls had first photographed the fairies, and the men were nervous. Doyle said this, "In my heart, I hardly expected success, for 3 years had passed, and I was well aware that the processes of puberty are often fatal to psychic power. Fatal to it."
Well, puberty be damned. The girls were successful. They were able to produce another 3 pictures that summer. They reported they had hoped to get more, but there had been several cold days, and fairies, as we know, hate the cold.
All right, so let's legit or bullshit what we have so far. What do we think about the additional accounts provided by Mr. Wade regarding fairy sightings and interactions? I just have to stick with bullshit.
I think that teenage girls are responsible for the Salem witch trials. They accused women of practicing witchcraft and were responsible for a bunch of women being hanged. I think that teenage girls can lie and cause all kinds of issues.
Yeah. Well, and they can summon poltergeists or create poltergeists.
Yes, they can. Completely and totally. I feel like Kate and Maggie Fox, who kicked off the entire spiritualist movement, were potentially, Kate claimed that they had lied. So there's another example of a couple of teenage girls taking a lie or joke too far. And I have to kind of wonder if that's not what has happened here as well.
I think there's a lot of daddy issues surrounding certain teenage girls who have to reach out for attention.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what they do. I think that my psychologist in me is saying that those stem from daddy issues. So
step up, dads.
Yeah, for fuck's sake.
All right, so we're both saying bullshit then.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to deviate for the remainder of our episode for today and kind of focus on that bullshit aspect for a little bit. But rest assured, we're going to pick this up again next week. What we want to point out is this. It's interesting to discuss this case and then to recall the case of Bridget Cleary, who was accused of being a fairy changeling by her husband, Michael Cleary, who doused her in paraffin and lit her on fire while her family stood by and watched.
Oh, We'll post the link for that book in our show notes, and you can find it on our website as well. Season 1, episodes 25, 26, and 27. And the book is The Burning of Bridget Cleary, a true story by Angela Burke. But the deal is this. People at the time of Bridget Cleary's death had vague and differing ideas on what fairies were and how they behaved.
Bridget was killed in 1895 in Ireland, and even if you account for location, the Cottingley incident taking place in Britain and whatnot, it had only been 25 short years prior to these photos that Bridget was murdered. In fact, Michael Cleary had only been released from prison in 1910.
Bridget was considered a changeling. Her family believed the real Bridget had been stolen and a fairy substitute had been left in her place. What is interesting is that in Bridget's case and in the region where she lived, fairies were creatures to be feared, not to interact with.
Exactly. Bridget's family viewed fairies as tricksters, liars, and thieves. Fairies could lure you from your home with fairy music or fairy lights. To come under their spell was dangerous. You might never return home again.
And so the question we put to you is, are there different races of fairies? Is this a geographic issue? Are fairies waiting to dance with you? Is interacting with a fairy a dangerous thing? Suppose for a minute that fairies are real. Think of your answer and let us know. Maybe you could have like, it could be like the Jets and the Sharks, right? You could have a good group of fairies and then the gangsta fairies, who are the thieves. I don't know.
The gangster fairies wear their Letterman's jackets.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We had talked a little bit in our Krampus episodes and, going back to Perkta and Santa and that it's possible when we talk about the Celts that fairies and dwarves may have been races of people who were displaced rather than being an actual creature that's on another realm or supernatural or paranormal.
Right.
So if we think about that, then there's really no way that the winged fairies that dance around or lure you into the woods they're just not real. What I kept thinking about when I was writing this episode was when Bridget Cleary got sick, she had been by what was an earthworks or a fairy mound. And
right.
They were very superstitious about those things and felt that some kind of evil magic had befallen her and that maybe she was sick because she was a changeling. She was no longer a human.
Right.
And that the real Bridget was somewhere else. So it gets interesting that the amount of fear that Bridget's entire family had about her being a fairy, and that's in one setting, and led to actually her being burned alive.
Yeah.
And then there's the young girls who are allowed to go out and play by themselves with fairies. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. I find it the difference in those beliefs very fascinating. And the fairy folk had been viewed, at least in my understanding, as you just don't interact with them. You don't acknowledge them. You don't pay attention. They do their thing. We do ours. So whether or not fairies are real, but whether or not they're real, it's irrelevant. The fact that these girls claim to have taken photos of something that seems to, of a creature that seems to have been deeply entrenched, the lore of which seemed to have been deeply entrenched in British Isle culture, photograph something that is not how a fairy would behave. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, yes, because of all the other cryptids, the Sasquatch and the Jersey Devil and the Mothman and, all of them, you have the same accounts from different places. You can be on different continents and you have the same accounts of things happening, very similar accounts. And so the fact that this occurred on the same continent as Bridget Cleary and the two accounts are very, very different, that right there, I think holds, pokes holes in the whole theory.
I agree. We're going to leave it here for this week. Next week, we're going to come back with another episode. We're going to continue this report on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his foray into fairyland.
And we'll give you our Yeti scores and let you in on some potential new developments in the case. Now that's a good teaser.
I know you're all going to be wondering what our Yeti scores are. I'm going to just have to ask you to be patient because I know it's really hard to tell what we're thinking sometimes. We play it close to the vest. We're hard to read.
For sure.
Anyway, we want to thank you all for listening. You guys always make every episode so much fun.
Absolutely. And we love hearing from you as well. So please reach out to us on Instagram or Facebook. You can also reach us at our website, ichabodshousepod.com.
We also have a couple of emails. You can reach us at Jen and Andy at ichabodhouse.com and ichabodhousepod@gmail.com. Until next time, remember, Ichabod loves you.
Carry a flashlight and always bring extra pants.